What's up, you fans of human cockfighting? It's your boy, the Xiaohudun of fighting fun, Jack Slack, and it's episode 88, I believe, of the Fights Gone By podcast, the big bastard bumper UFC 226 preview episode. Woo! And having had 2 weeks of waiting for fights to happen, because fucked if I'm reviewing Alima McFarlane versus whoever, and then Ryan Couture getting sparked by Sadawad, now we're actually coming on possibly the biggest event of the year. A very big one. Now, of course, whenever you start talking about it, you run the risk of jinxing it and then fights being called off. But I think I can say fairly confidently that some kind of mishap could happen to a bus full of the fighters on this card, and it would still be a strong card. But we'll get onto that in just a minute, because the news this week has been probably the most UFC-esque, well, but the most MMA-esque week of news in quite a while. Just, you're going down this list and going, yeah, of course that happened, for fuck's sake. You'll see. So, first piece of news, Volkan Ozdemir is off the Hamburg card to fight Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 227. I don't think Gustafsson had an opponent who was injured, did he? I can't remember, but they took, there's no reason that they should be cancelling that main event of UFC Hamburg. They just hate Europe. That's the thing. I mean, the European cards, generally the quality of the card is much lower, and they don't bring out the big names, and they tend to bring out the big names that, they're not really big names, but they're vaguely European or something like that. Here's Marcus Davies. He's vaguely Irish. Better not call him the Irish hand grenade, though. But yeah, so Volkan Ozdemir's off the card, and you're left with Stefan Struve versus someone else. So fuck you, Germany. That's what you get for losing in the World Cup so quickly. I presume they'll find Shogun another opponent. Ilir Latifi and whoever he's fighting are on the card. Oh, Glover Teixeira and Ilir Latifi. So two old men there. And then your Coco main event is marching to Tabura versus Stefan Struve because they're European and, fuck you. Oh, I know, apparently Anthony Smith has stepped in at the last minute to knock out another ailing legend, even though he's not really a light heavyweight. But yeah, that's the state of that card. Fucking hell, that's shit. Actually, no, to be fair, you got Mark Chiesa fighting some person with no Wikipedia page, and you got Danny Roberts versus Alan Jouban. That should be fun enough. MLB Weber Meek is on the prelims. No, it's still pretty shit, to be honest. But that's just the most UFC thing ever, to pull an opponent for no reason other than to make a later event better. Which is, like, if European MMA fans weren't so masochistic and didn't immediately buy out all tickets for all events as soon as they come on sale, regardless of what shit is in the main event and what shit is on the rest of the card, maybe the UFC would have to act differently, but they don't. So, card liable to change, no refunds, get fucked. The fact that big money Stefan Struve is still on main cards today fucks me off no end. But enough moaning about that, there's other stuff to moan about. On the subject of ridiculous match changes, Ally Akinta, having signed a contract to fight Justin Gaethje, pulled out of the fight saying that he didn't know how close it was. And just came up with like 8 different excuses on Ariel Helwani's show. The dude is erratic, yeah, we'll give him that, but just, the contract has the date on. You're not engaging to be engaged. You're signing a contract to fight on a certain date. And then there was an injury and all sorts of other stuff. He didn't like how the UFC was treating him, but now he's okay with the UFC. Just, the guy is a raving lunatic. And if he didn't have a decent right hand, we wouldn't be talking about him. So James Vick is pulled from his fight with Paul Felder to fight Justin Gaethje on the main event of another show. Paul Felder, the definition of a company man, he fights on short notice against whoever they want and does the commentary for their broadcasts, and a really good job of it, actually. And, when they wanted Francisco Trinaldo to just fuck off because he was winning too many fights and he's super old, much like Shogun, they called in Felder to try and beat him, though Felder did ultimately lose that fight. But yeah, Felder, one of the most exciting fighters in the division, does whatever the UFC asks him to, and they just screw him over by taking away this opponent. And then they're like, it's okay, you can fight Mike Perry at the last minute. Mike Perry, actual massive welterweight with huge hitting power. That's no way a change up from James Vick, lightweight. I mean, it just shows that, the more of a company man you are, the more comfortable they're going to feel screwing you over. Everyone whines about Conor McGregor, turning the tables and having the UFC by the balls, but frankly, that's how you should do it. You should just give them what they want, appear to be more of a agreeable guy than you actually are, and then when the moment you have leverage, just turn around and say, fuck you, pay me. Harlan Ellison died this week, unrelated news, but he was very famous for saying, fuck you, pay me. So, one of my heroes in that respect, even though I didn't ever read any of his books. What else happened? Couple of interesting announcements out of Rising. Diego Brandau's gone to Rising, and he's been matched up with Satoru Kitaoka. That, on the surface of things, is a very fun fight. Kitaoka, a wild man grappler, can't really strike, but can really take a beating. Diego Brandao, very good grappler, chooses to bang it out on the feet, gasses very quickly, but can really dish out the damage there. Of course, when we're talking about erratic people, Diego Brandao is top of the list. He will flip out at the slightest provocation. The last fight he had was against Ahmed Aliyev back in September of 2017. You'll recall that the moment he had success early on and then started getting body kicked all the way through. If you haven't seen that fight, Aliyev's awesome. He's just fading away and body kicking him. And then as soon as he's tired and gets taken down, he just throws a fit and jumps out of the cage and gets himself disqualified. The dude is a nutcase and also a really bad sport. And also tends to gas in almost every fight that he has because he literally sprints into his punching flurries. His fight against Dustin Poirier, where he came in massively overweight and said he was going to stab Poirier with a knife, and then he just ran at Poirier and tired himself out and got battered. It was great to watch at the time, but, Brandao could be a very, very good fighter if he weren't so stupid, just generally. And then the other announcement out of Rising was that Melvin Gillard versus Takanori Gomi is on, a fight that would have... actually, I don't know if that ever would have been significant. Both of them have had peaks and very severe drop-offs after that, and I don't know if they ever really matched up in terms of being good at the same time. Some gym-related news. Andre Pederneiras, Didi Pederneiras, has left Nova Unao, the gym that he founded like 20 years ago, and was very famous for taking kids off the street and making them into fighters. Jose Aldo, Claudia Gadelia, Renan Barao, all poor kids in the favela. And they went to train with him and they became world-class fighters. If you've ever seen Nova now, it's pretty much what you would expect from a gym in a ghetto. It doesn't have an awful lot of top-quality equipment. And the story is that Pederneiras isn't leaving to retire, he's leaving to start a mega gym where athletes from all over Brazil can come for his expertise. I don't know where they're going to set that up, but it certainly sounds interesting. If he could do like a Evolve MMA sort of thing, with a mega gym just in the middle of Brazil that people could travel to and train at, that would be amazing. Elsewhere, Moody's, the big number firm, announced that UFC revenue through 2017 was over $700 million, which is fairly impressive, and just shows that none of us really know how this is working. Well, I mean, Dave Meltzer came out the other week and said this TV deal with ESPN Plus, while everyone who watches the sport and wants the sport to interest more people and get higher buy rates is saying, oh my God, what the hell is this? The UFC is going to make money hand over fist for however long because of this TV deal, ESPN deal, whatever. Very peculiar, but good on him. I know that a good amount of that came from the McGregor-Mayweather fight, which obviously you can't rely on every year, but interesting to see how that goes forward. Because as a spectator and someone who writes about the sport and lives off traffic for information about the sport, I'm watching it going, Jesus, these guys are terrible at advertising their fights and selling their fighters. But who knows, maybe there's loads of people buying Reebok UFC gear. I saw someone in town wearing some of that the other day. I was just blown away that actually happens. And then the final depressing piece of news this week is that Golden Boy Promotions have signed Chuck vs Tito 3 for an MMA card later in the year. When I heard about this, I immediately had a tirade on Twitter and Facebook and just said I wish this sport would grow the fuck up and move on. Nobody is wondering what the 2003 Manchester United team is up to now. No one wants to see 2003 Manchester United versus 2003 Manchester City in 2018. Yet in MMA, this is still an enormous thing for us. And, it's the logical conclusion of all the nostalgia boner fluffing that the big companies have been doing for the last however many years. If you keep putting the UFC were guilty of it anyway. Tito Ortiz hadn't won a fight in like a decade at one point, and they were still putting him on main cards. Forrest versus Tito 3, anyone? I think hopefully this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. A lot of people, most of the feedback I've seen online about this announcement have been negative. Even the people who are normally like, they're warriors, let them be warriors. Let them die in the cage, it's what they want. Yeah, that'll work out well for the rest of us who want to enjoy the sport. The closest I've seen to justifying this is people saying, well, it's so that Golden Boy can get into MMA, and then they'll be building people on the undercard of that fight. And you're going, no, that's not really going to work. Like, I'll at the time, if they get in a load of young, promising fighters on the undercard, and the rest of the main card, I'll be very impressed. But given that it's Golden Boy, it'll probably just be a main event and fuck all else. Maybe they'll get Gary Goodrich or someone out of retirement, Pedro Hizzo, to fight just before Chuck and Tito go on. Who knows? At any rate, it's the saddest shit in the world, and if you buy it, you are part of what's wrong with this business. Right, anyway, let's get into UFC 226 stuff, because this card is fucking insane. Obviously, you got two title fights as the main and co-main event, and this is one of those ones where co-main event actually means co-main event. Either of these could headline, and they're both amazing. Though, of course, the actual headliner, Stipe versus Cormier, is, well, not two titles on the line, but champion versus champion. Very, very rare in most MMA, to be honest. When it happened with Narkun versus Khalidov the other month, I went mental, but very rare in the UFC. BJ Penn versus George St. Pierre is the last one that I can remember. I mean, you could have George St. Pierre versus Michael Bisping, but it wasn't really a thing. I mean, Conor McGregor versus Eddie Alvarez is one, but they really sat on that belt. Daniel Cormier is still defending his light heavyweight title, so good on him. Very rare for this to happen. But we're talking about the rest of the card first, because this is absolutely stacked. I was just looking at the curtain jerker here, the very first early prelim, Lando Venata versus Draco Close, and I was thinking, I know Draco Close, what do I know him from? Oh yes, he was a nominee for the 2017 But Why Slacky for standing stationary and complaining that David Tamer wasn't engaging him even while getting outstruck. Actually worked because the referee was warning, I think it was Herb Dean, was warning David Tamer as Tamer was kicking the shit out of him. Just the weirdest fight, made me really, really angry watching it. I mean, maybe it wouldn't make other people so angry, but I'm watching it going, this guy's actually boxing you up, and he's getting warned for being inactive because you're waving your hands and saying, come and hit me, while he's hitting you. Infuriating stuff. In fact, that's the reason that he didn't win the But Why Slacky, because it actually worked, and the referee was going, yeah, David, why are you stalling? Meanwhile, Lando Venata, I believe, is going to be remembered as one of those fighters who is much, much better than their record reflects. Because, he went even with Tony Ferguson on short notice and lost that fight. But he's never been easy work for anyone. He's 1-2-1 in his UFC career, so he's lost 2 fights, drawn 1, and only actually beaten John McDacey by a startling KO. But he is much better than that record would reflect. Additionally, he's won Fight of the Night 3 times and Performance of the Night the one time that the fight didn't go past the opening minute. So, a very exciting fighter who you really can't afford to miss. What I do like about Lando Venata is, and I say this every time, I always say, Lando Venata, Yair Rodriguez comparison. But you watch him use that sidekick to the lead. Well, he uses it to the thigh a lot more than the knee, actually. But he just does it to piss people off. So they step in to try and punch, and he'll just step on their thigh and buckle their stance, and they'll swing wild and miss. Or he'll just needle them. He'll go at them like floating forward and placing it on their knee. And when you use it in that way, the guy isn't going to run a mile every time you do it. So he can pick up his knee, put it down outside the opponent's lead foot, and be in a dominant southpaw or southpaw versus orthodox or open guard position to keep hitting. Very interesting in that regard. And he uses a lot of weaves too. So he'll throw his right hand and then weave up to his right side again to throw his right hand again. His left hand isn't really anything to write home about, but he does have... he's a wily dude. And even that bit of... head movement that he uses the same bit of head movement over and over again, but just doing that makes him such a hard target for even the top guys in MMA. There's such a difference between the level of boxing in professional boxing and the level of boxing in MMA that even just a weave will save your brain a lot of the time. does mean that he's down there for knees, and that was the old Gary Goodridge Igor Vovchanchin thing. Obviously Goodridge lost both those fights, but he realized that Vovchanchin ducks after every punch that he throws or every engagement, so he just tried to keep kneeing him on the way out, and he actually opened up Igor's face pretty badly. But Vannata found against Ferguson was that Ferguson was able to snap him down and start working on Darces and guillotines. David Tamer did a great job of pounding him with long round kicks and straights down the centre when he stepped in to engage. Also did great work out of the clinch in that fight, using the whizzer and the head in front of Vannata's and then landing knees to the body, much like Leon Edwards was doing the other night in that fight that you probably didn't watch because there was no reason to watch that event, but that fight was really good. I like that fight a lot. I hope Vannata picks up a win, because we're at that place where he's almost going to turn into Darren Cruikshank, where he's going to have a load of losses, and you're going to go, but he could have won any of those fights, and they'll cut him, and you'll be going, why did you cut him? He's reliably one of the most entertaining fighters on the roster. Oh, okay, there we go. There is a fight on this card that I know fucking nothing about. The number 109th flyweight in the world, Emily Whitmere, 2-2-0, versus Jamie Moyle, 4-2-0. Yeah, is there more to that? I'm gonna people in the comments tell me if there's more to that, or if that is just a rubbish fight that they've thrown on there. Then you got Gilbert Burns versus Dan Hooker, my boy Dan Hooker, my son, as Fabricio Verdun would say. He's my son. No, Dan Hooker is a legend. I absolutely love his fighting style. Very, very cautious, very crafty, and diffused two very dangerous counter-strikers of very different kinds in Ross Pearson and Mark Chiesa. And if you want to see dealing with the low-line sidekick, that fight with Chiesa is a great example. Chiesa was coming off the performance where he couldn't get Timo Pakirin, or whatever his name is, to run at him, so he kicked him in the leg, tore his MCL open, which Timo hasn't come back from yet. That was a year and a half ago or something like that. And then Timu ran at him because his knee fell apart, so he got knocked out with a counterpunch. Hooker was never there for it, never there for anything. He was there, but he wasn't there. It was the best kind of distancing. He was there, and he was constantly within hitting reach of Chiesa when he wanted to be, but when Chiesa came at him, he suddenly wasn't there anymore. Absolutely brilliant performance, tons of feints, had Chiesa spinning and jumping for back kicks and shit that just weren't there, and then once you've made them miss that, they're not going to do it again so easily. They're probably going to hold off until they feel they've got your timing down. And if you keep feinting and jabbing and, throwing out non-committal strikes, they're going to have a really hard time getting your timing down anyway. Cannot recommend watching that fight with Chiesa highly enough, because Chiesa was a guy who came in with all the hype in the world for a good reason. Very athletic, very explosive. Also black, so he was black explosive. But, he was a very slick counter-fighter who could knock guys out very easily if he got them running at him. And Dan Hooker just said, nah, mate, we're going to do it at my distance, at my tempo. And then he guillotined him, I think, in the third round. He made Chiesa go for these takedowns that just you wouldn't see Chiesa going for normally. Gilbert Burns, meanwhile, fantastic grappler. Watch his match with Gary Tonin, because that is real Brazilian jiu-jitsu versus, the modern leg lock meta. And he does ultimately heel hook. I think it was a heel hook, might have been a knee bar, but he heel hooks Durinho by basically letting him pass his guard and then getting up into a quad pod position and diving through his own legs after Gilbert burns his legs each time. Great match on, it was Polaris, I think, and it's on UFC Fight Pass. But Gilbert Burns is a terrifically fun fighter because he can bang. He's not a great technical striker. He's throwing uppercuts from behind him, from down by his arse. He takes his uppercut out of his back pocket. But he did, I can't remember who was the last lad he fought, but he absolutely starched him. And it was almost out of nowhere. He just went to the fence, hit him, and the guy fell down and hit his own head on his knee as he collapsed. It was one of those imploding building, controlled demolition sort of drops. Very cool stuff. And Durinho actually has, I think, 3 or 4 arm bars in the UFC, which is a lot. If you look at all-time armbar records, it's Ronda Rousey, obviously, and Sakuraba in major promotions. But most guys don't get armbars often, or don't get armbarred often. So if you can hit him in high-level MMA, you're doing well. And he does that thing that BJ Penn used to do. He did it against Jens Pulver, but he used to teach it at seminars, where you let the guy roll from mount and you go over the back with the armbar, and you can actually encourage them to do that by reaching behind your own back, catching their thigh, and sort of like encouraging them to turn to their knees. Yeah, he did that in one of his fights. It was awesome. Really big fan of both these guys. Obviously, I would say to Burns, get him down, or at least get him along the fence, get on his hips, and then come up banging. Because, the advantages that Dan Hooker has in striking are going to be more evident out in free range. If you've got him against the fence and he's defending takedowns and you're coming up swinging, you've at least got him at a disadvantage when you're starting the striking exchanges. And of course, if you can get mooring about that, it makes it a lot easier to drop back in on the hips and take him down again. For Hooker, obviously keep the range. I mean, needle him with the low kicks, I'd say. The low calf kick, I'd love to see that in action against Burns, and jab him up, because he's got a reach and height advantage, I believe, because he has a reach and height advantage over almost everyone in that division. He's a very tall lad, Dan Hooker. Max Griffin versus Curtis Millender. Honestly, don't know as much about Max Griffin as I probably should. Watched a couple of his fights, and Curtis Millender also don't know much about, so we'll skip over that one. Rafael Assuncao versus Rob Font. Oh, now that is premium bantamweight action, sir. You know the deal with Rafael Assuncao. He's deserved a title shot for a very long time. Will never ever get one because he's got a very boring style, only speaks Portuguese, and just could not be marketable for anyone. Has no beef with Team Alpha Male or Dominic Cruz. Though he should have inbuilt beef with Dominic Cruz, because Dominic Cruz never fought him, and he was basically clearing out the division at the time. Went down to bantamweight in 2011. Has lost a grand total of 1 fight since then to TJ Dillashaw, a close decision, having won a close decision over Dillashaw a few years earlier. On the other hand, he's been fairly plagued by injuries, and just can't finish a fight for toffee. Though he did finish his most recent fight against Matthew Lopez in round 3, having done his usual control the distance, occasionally counter-strike stuff, he decided to run in and finish him with a couple of minutes to go. So that was pretty cool. Rob Font, my boy, has been in the UFC since 2014. I do not remember any of this. He knocked out George Roop. I probably remember that because George Roop has a habit of getting knocked out in ragdoll physics sort of ways, because he's such a tall guy who cuts so much weight. Lost a decision to John Lineker, I recall that one. Got choked by Pedro Munoz while boxing him up, I recall that. And then in his most recent performance, he really put a boxing lesson on Thomas Almeida. It was lovely. Really showed the importance of the jab there. Thomas Almeida, an offensive buzzsaw, but also sort of a offensive counter-striker in many senses. He moves forward, he slips as soon as you throw something, and he tries to come back with like the left hook to the liver, or he'll slip inside and try and throw the right elbow over the top. If you ever see that, well, he's landed a couple of times actually, but that as a counter is so powerful that, where you would slip to the inside of the jab and throw the right hand over the top like a cross counter, if you shorten it and bring the elbow across the top, you can straight up murder dudes, just melt them where they stand. Nate Corbett was very good at that, very good counter fighter with his elbows. But yeah, against Almeida, he started giving him the jab, making him slip or show his hand with the slips, and then cracking him when he was slipping out the way. Knocked him out in the second round. I really should revisit that fight because I remember really enjoying it at the time. But I think for this fight, I like Rob Font as an opponent for Assuncao in that he uses feints and he understands that the jab being used, doubling the jab, flicking out the jab, pounding in the jab, doing different things with the jab, it draws reactions, and that's very good against guys who are just looking to stand back and counter, for confusing them, that is. We're going to be talking about this a bit with Max Holloway in a minute, but Rafael Assuncao is a very annoying sort of striker because he uses long straight kicks and then the occasional counterpunch. I've got an article going out either this week or next week, depending on what we decide to do with Vice Sports, on beating the oblique kick and the low-line side kick. And TJ Dillashaw's performance against Rafael Assuncao really showed how to upset someone who's using those low-line straight kicks, which are an amazing... you can use them to hurt people, but you have to be very stupid to stand there and let someone just pound you in the leg over and over again, i.e. Rampage or Vitor Belfort against John Jones. Most of the time, that kick is to stop you doing things rather than to say, I'm just going to keep landing those. Because as soon as you start moving side to side or pulling your foot back when you see them try it, that kick becomes worthless for damage. It is literally just stopping someone from doing something. What TJ Dillashaw was able to... Assuncao went to it against Dillashaw because Dillashaw was switching stances and bothering him. So he gets on open stance with him and starts trying to put it into his knee. And he annoys him with the first couple. And then Dillashaw fakes a step in with his left foot forward and Assuncao southpaw. And then he performs like his Superman jab/drop shift movement in the air, picking up the lead foot, switching feet, and stepping in with what was the rear foot. And then he's in on him and he's boxing him. Again, it's absolutely brilliant because the target area, the line that you're attacking with the low line side kicks and the oblique kicks is very, very slim. Think about how far apart. If you just stand where you are and you go orthodox and then you switch to southpaw, think about the distance between where your front knee was. It's like a foot and a half to the left or right. So he did that and he kept coming in on the opposite foot and it really bothered Assuncao and he just dropped that kick altogether. Watch out for that article. The GIFs are awesome in it. And the content is, of course, awesome because I wrote it. But faking people out really works well against the oblique kick and the low line side kick because it is just a kick that stops people from walking in on you. The problem is that Rob Font, I think, tends to stick to one stance more, which you can still feint them out and have them stepping on your leg when it isn't there and then come in behind it, or get in with your leg before they've got their leg up and then they're on one foot and getting knocked out while they're trying to kick your leg, as Ollie Enkamp found out against Danny Roberts. You mistime that kick, you're just stepping on a braced leg and being hit in the face at the same time. So I think it'll be interesting to see how Assuncao's annoying keeping of distance and range matches up against Rob Font's jab and understanding of the ring. If Rob Font uses his jab and feints well and uses the ring well, he should be able to get Assuncao into positions where he can hit him with the right hand and start hurting him. If Assuncao can keep circling off the cage, it really won't matter that much how much Rob Font feints successfully because he should be able to keep the distance still. Of course, Assuncao being a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and very rarely using it, he could just flip the script and suddenly take him down in round 2. But that and Dan Hooker versus Gilbert Burns, low-key could be fight of the night. More likely, we'll get an amazing main or co-main event and we'll just have this 4.5 star match on the undercard that everyone sort of overlooks. That's the nature of being on one of these massive cards. If one of these guys put on an amazing performance on a fight night card, at least they'd get the attention from the fans because there's fuck all else to talk about. Like Leon Edwards. Oh, I gave myself hiccups by laughing too hard at my own joke like a fucking loser. That really hurts. We'll plough through and you'll just have to put up with my hiccups. Paul Felder versus Mike Perry. Jesus, is that on this card? I thought that was in 2 weeks' time. Wow, no time at all for Paul Felder. Oh. So you got the number 14 according to Tapology. I like Tapology, so I'm using their rankings for the moment. But to be fair, I like Tapology for its layout because it's got a nice thing with glossy headshots where I can read the card. I quite like Fight Matrix for the overall rankings just because there's no bias in it. There's just some numbers that a nerd put together. But they got Felder is number 14 ranked lightweight in the world. Yeah, I'd put him around there. I'd say he's done enough that he should be edging into the top 10. And then Mike Perry is number 26 welterweight in the world. That division, I'm struggling to remember even half the guys in it. But yeah, you got a well-ranked welterweight versus a well-ranked lightweight. That should be the welterweight's territory. But this, again, short notice match. Paul Felder is a massive lightweight, but he was probably already somewhere deep into working his way down to weight. I suppose at least he gets the days to say, oh, okay, cool, I'm not cutting weight anymore, and actually, probably just eat steak and whatever he wants for the rest of the week, which is quite nice, but it's certainly ballsy to take that fight. One thing I do like about it is that Paul Felder is a very hard low kicker, and Mike Perry has had trouble with that in the past. Obviously, Perry's thing is to jump in on dudes and swing wildly. Paul Felder is not defensively very sound. He got into the habit of following Darren Cruikshank, and Darren Cruikshank gave him the sweet chin music, sidekicked him in the face several times, just because every time he's darted out with the right hand, and then Felder would turn to face him and walk straight at him. I think Felder could do well here with what he did against Alexander... What was his name? Ricci? Alessandro Ricci? Christina Ricci? where he used the intercepting upward elbow. I think intercepting elbow is a very good choice against Mike Perry. I don't think Felder will be able to hold him against the fence and use that single underhook pin that he often uses, where he... lots of guys throw sloppy short punches from there and look for knees and just look to wrap the body lock and throw the guy forward onto his hands. That's the AKA method. Felder is very good at posting his head on the guy and then pulling his head back and slamming in the elbow as hard as possible. He melted... Who did he melt? Was it Oliveira like that? Can't remember. But he's got a few elbows in a row now, stoppages. If he uses them on the counter in this fight and has Perry running onto them, he could really give Perry a bad night. And that's a nice thing because it's not relying on hitting power, because if you've got a welterweight and a lightweight, the welterweight is probably going to be able to take the better blows and give the harder blows. Even though Felder will be coming in something around that weight, Perry presumably would have been cutting to get to welterweight for something else. Unless they set this up at a catch weight of some kind, but it says it's 170 here. But yeah, the great thing about elbows is that if you can rigidly hold your elbow up and step in as the other guy steps in, they're providing a ton of force to that without you having to swing your hand or turn your body and create the force for it. Perry actually has a really good, or a surprisingly good kicking game he showed against Ellenberger. He was using this step-up left round kick, and he was using it to the leg, to the body, and the head. And it worked really well, and then he just never showed it again. He's a real enigma, and I think a lot of it comes from working at a fairly, not world-class gym for a very long time. He's clearly got a ton of talent, but he also doesn't have the people there pushing him to sharpen it all up. Sadly, the first fight without the Platinum Princess, I believe. But anyway, let's move on. Paulo Costa versus Uriah Hall. There you go. This is the one between the middleweight that they wanted to be great and the middleweight that still has the chance of being great. Oh, Uriah Hall is the most frustrating fighter in the world. Partly because he has, people go on about no killer instinct, but he really doesn't push his advantages well. It's like if he knocks a guy out, it's because he suddenly wanted to do a spin kick and did it. It's not like he sees a guy tiring or he sees that he's been landing a jab well or something like that. Also, he's got a really long reach but doesn't really box very well. In the tough episodes, Chael was like, pump that jab. And, he was jabbing and landing it, but it was mainly because the other guy didn't really know what he was doing. The other thing about Hall is that he just spins for spinning's sake at certain points. That's how he lost his fight against Robert Whittaker. He went fairly well with Robert Whittaker, who is now the best middleweight in the world, possibly ever. But the way that Whittaker won that fight was that every time Uriah spun for a back elbow or a wheel kick or something like that, he just latched onto his back. There were several rounds of that fight that he won just by taking the back body lock and not giving it up. Meanwhile, Paulo Costa is the juiciest slut on the roster. Oh, wish I'd done something with that for the intro. Paulo Costa, juiciest slut on the roster. It's the same as your Romero. You are not... If you're arguing that they're not on drugs, you're arguing that they didn't fail a test, which is fine. That's enough. That's all we ask in this sport, but they are so clearly juiced to the gills, these guys. Paulo Costa is firstly gigantic, secondly capped delts, mate, but he's passing the tests, which fair play to him is more than John Jones has ever done, or Anderson Silva for that matter. Someone was on fucking Reddit the other day saying, hey, Anderson Silva took drugs once he was 40 years old and coming off a crippling leg injury. There's no reason to suppose that he did drugs before that. Firstly, he tested positive the first time that he was tested randomly. That's not, And also, if you're willing to do drugs because you've slowed down a bit and you're getting older, why would you not be willing to do drugs to be the best in the world before that? And then, do you get to keep using, he's coming off a career-threatening leg injury, if we're now 3 years on and he's just been caught roiding up again to fight another welterweight? The dude was probably juiced his entire career. Obviously, everyone had a bit more freedom to juice back then, but don't be a bellend. Just I'll be like, well, I believe he wasn't on drugs when he mysteriously became a much better fighter after missing his athletic prime the first time around. Yeah, he'd done shit in Japan, and he came to the UFC, and he was really desperately trying to make things work, and he was penniless, and this was his last chance. But he wouldn't have taken drugs then. No, only when he was an old man. Which matches up with all that stuff that people are like, well, he doesn't really care about fighting anymore, he just does it for fun. Okay, so why does he cheat all the time? Oh, there's my Anderson Silva rant for the week. And we've got Khalil Roundtree coming up in a minute, who's Anderson Silva's Bezzy. But back to the subject at hand, Paulo Costa is an extremely powerful fighter. I will be very interested if he can do what he did to Hendricks against Hall. Obviously, completely different build and type of fighter. But if you can back him up and hit him with the body kicks, I will be very interested to see what Hall can do. Hall is the kind of guy who, much like Raymond Daniels, if you put him against the cage and threaten him, his answer is to try and hit you as hard as possible to get you off him, rather than to move away from you or, break off and circle out. When his coaches shout circle out, he wheel kicks. That's what I'm saying. But I really like that. If Uriah Hall wins this fight convincingly, that is a real feather. That could basically save his career path, because he keeps getting put in with the guy. Well, he's 13-8 now. He keeps getting put in with the guys and just not impressing. There's only so far you can go on a win over Chris Lieben. But anyway, let's move on. Gokhan Saki versus Khalil Roundtree. I've got a Saki technique coming out. A Saki article coming out either today or tomorrow or something like that. And basically just looking at his style in kickboxing and how he's adapted it for MMA. Obviously, we've only got one round of MMA to work on. But what really intrigued me was, he doesn't get the opportunities to flurry as much as he used to, because in kickboxing, even at the highest levels of the game, simply covering up is enough. Robin van Roosmalen has almost no footwork, has no head movement to talk about. He really does just rely on getting his gloves up. And it works in kickboxing, but with small gloves, that is death. And if the guy can then jump in on your hips or clinch you or grab a hold of your head, that is also death. So Gokhan Saki fought a lot of guys who would just cover up and wait for their turn to fire, and he'd just keep them under fire with 8-punch combinations. The other side of Saki is the counterpuncher, which is what he showed a lot more of against Enrique da Silva. Obviously, Enrique da Silva, not a very good fighter, and was a kickboxer that they specifically picked to lose to Saki, but he switched to southpaw, used the southpaw double attack, left high kick and left straight very well, dropped him very early with that, and then he was just looking for sort of one big shot looping over the opponent's straight punches, crossing them, as they would say in the oldie days, but he'll do it with the lead hook from both stances, and of course the overhand from the rear hand, and a couple of times he let Enrique da Silva in on his hips from that, and a couple of times he let him in on his head with a double collar tie, which late in the round he got badly shaken by an elbow, which is interesting because he was world, quotations whenever we say world kickboxing or Muay Thai champion, but he was world Muay Thai champion in 2003, but he seemed really, really uncomfortable with striking in the clinch. And I think a lot of that is because he's been working so hard on his wrestling and stuff, but what I was encouraged by was the acceptance that this is a completely different style of striking, even for the best strikers in the world. And Saki showed this understanding of that. And that's what you're seeing with guys like Israel Adesanya. They don't strike the same in kickboxing that they do in MMA. They realise there's a lot more needs to be done. You need to be a lot more cautious a lot of the time, and you need to move your feet, because your feet are the first line of defence against the takedown. And once you're getting into stopping the takedown, that's worst case scenario stuff. You should just be denying the takedown by not being there. But yeah, really enjoyed Saki's debut, and I hope he does well here. Khalil Roundtree, big banger. Anderson Silva back in the day was saying they had in their gym who was just an unstoppable puncher and would be the next great light heavyweight or middleweight or whatever. And I think they were talking about Khalil Roundtree at that time, or he was talking about Khalil Roundtree at the time. But Khalil Roundtree's body transformation from when he was a big fat lad to now is pretty amazing. He seemed very, very nervous in the interview I saw him do the other day. But a fun enough fighter, just a little bit flawed and not rounded, not tremendously rounded. His big strength is banging, and against Gokhan Saki, that's a dangerous thing to be your main thing. I don't know if he's a strong enough wrestler or strong enough at mixing his tactics, that he can get Saki down consistently. But we'll see. Really, for him, it's not about dive on Saki's hips, because that's what Saki's been training for the last 2-3 years. If you're fighting Saki, the tactics should be throw punches, get in on his hips, come up throwing punches, get in on his hips again. You really got to use the two to throw him off, because the thing about guys with a great kickboxing game who've built wrestling onto that is that you want to get them in a position where they're dealing with both at once, rather than doing their thing on the feet and then dealing with the wrestling, and then only dealing with the wrestling. Pettis versus Chiesa, finally happening after it was that other bus incident that will not go mentioned happened. But I like this a lot. I think I said this last time we talked about it, or it might have already been called off, but one of the reasons this is such an interesting matchup is purely because Michael Chiesa, very good at getting people's backs, Anthony Pettis, absurdly good at escaping back control. Just what a weird thing to be great at. Charles Oliveira, who is legitimately a killer from the back, took his back like 12 times in their fight, and every time Pettis pulled the arm across to the other side, bridged into him and turned over into closed guard. And that was like how Pettis got him to the ground. It was this fucking weirdest thing I've ever seen, and nobody talks about it, which makes it weirder. I think a lot of this will come down to Pettis' ringcraft, which hasn't always been the sharpest in recent years. He's very, very good when he traps a guy along the fence, as seen, against Jim Miller. He showed like the vintage aggression along the fence that he had against Donald Cerrone, Benson Henderson back in the day. But I think Chiesa is going to get out right after him from the get-go and try and box his way into a clinch along the fence. So if Pettis can circle off and put in the kick to the open side, obviously he's not ambidextrous as a strike. He's a lot better as a southpaw in IMHO. But if he can work to circling out to the open side and then land the body kick and threaten the high kick and land the body kick, I think he can probably start to wear on Chiesa. Chiesa, very drawn out for a lightweight, very tall guy, very thin, very low body fat, which generally is a great indicator that you should kick the shit out of someone's body if they clearly cut a lot of weight and are very tall and long. That there is like Pettis' big equalizer in this fight. I mean, obviously, Chiesa could get him to the ground and then he could just look unsubmittable because Pettis is very, very good on the ground. In recent years, I'd say that he's probably been more entertaining on the ground than he's been on the feet, but I think, circling out, throwing the body kick, looking for left straights or right straights through the open side, depending on Chiesa's stance. The longer he can keep it standing and the more comfortably he can circle off while staying in hitting distance, that should tell us a lot about this fight. I expect him to get clinched up early, and then we'll have to see how he deals with that. But control of the distance and also where it happens in the cage should really play a big factor in this fight, if Chiesa's as aggressive as I expect him to be. Because he can't fanny around at range with Pettis. That's basically the rule. Even when he's been beaten up in recent years, there's been guys constantly sticking to him, making him, doing what RDA showed you can do, just putting him under pressure and making it hard for him to kick because he's going to lose his footing as you step in on him. Additionally, he really does over-rely on the 1-2. He doesn't have much else in the boxing. Like, RDA would just keep walking him down. He'd throw the 1-2, RDA would take it on his forearms, and then he'd come back with 3 or 4 punches of differing angle and path. But hey, we're on to the main card now. I forgot that. Forgot to announce it, guys. Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis. This one is an interesting one, because Francis Ngannou is possibly the most overhyped fighter of all time, but the heavyweight division is so bad that he might be the second best heavyweight in the world. Derek Lewis, obviously, serial gasser. You got 2 big old gassers in this fight. Jesus Christ. If this goes past the first round, we're in trouble. Derek Lewis's striking is not great, generally. What he does very well is get on top of people and smash them in the head, and meme. That's mainly what he does well. Francis Ngannou, as much as I got on people about his world-class boxing or whatever, and his hardest punch in the world, that is all bollocks. He doesn't box tremendously well. He throws a couple of nice counters when his opponent shows him anything. And there are much harder hitters out there, I'm sure, in terms of professional boxers and professional kickboxers. But he is still much better than the majority of heavyweights. A lot of his stuff is like lean back, swing the left hook as you're leaning back, and then come back with the right uppercut. It's not particularly high-level boxing. It's not particularly high-level counterpunching. It's not particularly high-level anything. But it is good enough when you hit as hard as him. The downside is, of course, it doesn't hold up over rounds. The moment he gets into like the second round and Stipe Miocic is feinting the jab, he's swinging at air, and then he's stopping swinging because he's awkward about swinging at air and doesn't want to waste his energy, and then he's getting jabbed in the face. If you people are going to go on and on about the wrestling in that fight, but if you watch the moments on the feet, past like the one moment where he bum rushed him in the first round, Francis Ngannou is swinging at air and getting jabbed up, basically. Do I think Derek Lewis is going to jab him up? No, Derek Lewis is not a good striker. I would be very interested if Derek Lewis can hold the clinch, because obviously The only thing we saw of Ngannou in the clinch before he got to Miocic was the brief moments against Alistair Overeem, who he turned onto the fence, and then Alistair Overeem went into his weird, I'm going to throw the right hand and try and run away at the same time method of fighting that he used against Ben Rothwell and didn't get, and got knocked out brutally there too. I expect Ngannou can probably grind down Lewis. You would hope that basically all Ngannou's been doing is cardio and just punching for rounds. Derek Lewis is not the kind of wrestler where he should be able to ragdoll him like Stipe did, or just lay on him and tire him out. But who knows? I'm waiting for Derek Lewis to happen. I really am. But Mark Hunt just came in and showed exactly what is wrong with almost all heavyweights. As soon as you get them past the first round, if you're feinting at them, making them swing wild, Derek Lewis was throwing bicycle kicks and spin kicks in that fight, but very quickly tired. It's awesome if you can do that. It's awesome that you can do a backflip as a heavyweight, but can you do that for more than 2 minutes? So, this fight just has all the potential in the world to either end quickly or be awful. So it is the epitome of a heavyweight fight. Let's move the fuck on. Oh, what I will say for Derek Lewis, though, is he used some nice low kicks in the Hunt fight, which I wish he'd used more. If he starts pounding those in against Ngannou, because Ngannou uses a very wide stance, and the whole thing about boxing generally is that the arsenal of counterpunches and combination punching and so on opens up when you can move your legs freely and move your weight from one foot to the other. Obviously, the more you are dealing with kicks, the shorter your stance is going to become. And of course, if you don't shorten your stance, your leg is just out there to be punted. So if Derek Lewis just went to the low kick over and over again and ducked out every time Francis Ngannou swung back at him, he might do fairly well on the feet, to be honest. Right, on to the really, really, really good fights. The ones that I anticipate being cancelled immediately after I put this podcast up. Max Holloway versus Brian Ortega. I love this fight. Max Holloway might be the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world. If it's not him, it's Robert Whittaker. What I love about Max Holloway and Robert Whittaker, both of them, is that they have well-rounded skill sets. They have things that they are better at than other things, but they do adapt their style fight to fight to deal with their opponent. If you watch Max Holloway's fights with Aldo, they are completely different to his fights with, say, Pettis or Stevens or whoever. If you watch Rob Whittaker's fights with Yoel Romero, there's stuff that's familiar, but they're also very, very different to his fights with, like, Jacare, Brunson, so on. Brian Ortega is the opposite of Max Holloway in the sense that where Max Holloway is a generalist whose game plan accentuates whatever needs to be done to win, Brian Ortega fights the way that he wants to fight, even if it's not, even if he has to like bang a square nail into a circular peg. No, the peg in the net. Bang a square peg into a circular hole. Ortega does three things well: plays the guard, snaps guys down and front chokes them, or front chokes them as they're shooting, or bangs on the feet, basically. He does the shoulder roll, not very well, but he does hit really hard on the feet. He goes after the body. He's a bit weird as a puncher. He really caught Frankie more because Frankie was hanging out in the pocket than because he set Frankie up or did anything particularly clever. And the uppercut he finished him with, again, it was a bus driver uppercut, came out of his back pocket. But he hits hard, and he times elbows really well, actually. He did time some really nice elbows on Frankie. I'm afraid I took some credit away from him there. But in terms of striking on the feet, he is very defensively porous. His shoulder roll doesn't actually function as a shoulder roll is supposed to. He's most susceptible to the right straight, which is the whole thing that the shoulder roll set up to deal with. If you watch his fight with Moicano really did a good job of boxing him up early on, then shot on a takedown as Ortega kept walking forward and pressuring him. I mean, Ortega has a chin on him. And, he just takes punches to the dome like they're nothing. And by pressing in on guys, he encourages them to change things up, grab a clinch, take him down. Very interesting to watch him fight because he almost never takes anyone down on his own terms. He does hit a lot of snapdowns. The snapdowns he hit on Cub Swanson were beautiful. He had this weird clinch in like Swanson's far armpit with the body lock, and then he just popped over the top and front headlocked him, and then rolled through to the anaconda choke. Got some cool gifts going up in the week of Brian Ortega's guard. He does... Against Tavares, who was tripoding up, he did a great job of making his body completely stiff, shoulders into the mat, hips off the mat, make a straight line to the opponent, and he was using his hand to take Tavares' head offline, and then he'd drop his hips down and elbow Tavares as he fell forward. It was absolutely gorgeous. Same sort of stuff that Bisping opened up George St. Pierre with. George St. Pierre, obviously a very successful tripoder from guard. Holloway's jab actually Ortega's jab actually looked pretty good against Edgar. He was tripling it and doing things with it, but it wasn't a super educated jab, but he was clearly using it to stifle Edgar because Edgar had such a short reach and height compared to Ortega. I think that was the one that I got really angry about, the tail of tape, because it said there was like 2 inches difference between them, and it was clearly like 5 in height, that is. I think for Holloway, there's holes there because because Moicano demonstrated them. He goes into the shoulder roll, you can still crack him in the head with the right hand. Edgar had great success hooking to the body from the shoulder roll, which is supposed to be covered up by the lead arm and the elbow with the rear arm. Max Holloway has a very good left hook, which I could see troubling Ortega, because you are dealing, it's a lot easier to use the rear hand to check the opponent's lead hand from the shoulder roll or the stonewall, whatever, if you want to consider it as a position rather than a single tactic, or a single movement rather. It's a lot easier to deal with the opponent's lead hand with your rear hand when you're wearing a big old catching mitten. It's a lot trickier when you're wearing baby gloves. I think I'd like to see Holloway jab the body and come up with the left hook off the jab. I think the left hook to the body could be really money for him. If you watched him against Aldo, the first time around, he was doing some nice stuff with the jab, drawing reactions. And Aldo, when he slipped to the elbow side, Holloway would throw the right round kick into basically his back, but because his elbow was out of position, he could hit him in the ribs. Very nice stuff. Holloway against Aldo was actually a great fight to watch, because Aldo always dealt in reactionary head movement rather than just general head movement. He'd stand perfectly still until you jabbed him, and then he'd move his head lightning fast and try and come back with a combination. Of course, as soon as the guy starts flicking out jabs that you can't tell if they're real or not, or jabbing from just out of range so that when you do slip, you can't really come back with a counter, and it was actually a pointless slip, that's when it starts getting messy. So Holloway was able to do that and tire Aldo out that way. Holloway was actually really good at breaking off the clinches in that fight, because he knew Aldo would try and get breaks. So you could see Aldo tire and then try and slip a punch and duck into the clinch, and Holloway's head would immediately post on his, and he'd come out of the clinch with the left hook. Very nice stuff all around. I think for Holloway, use of the jab is important. Keep Ortega in the shell. Keep the hand up to parry Ortega's jab. Look for the left hook off the jab. Jab the body and look for the left hook off that. The right straight could be money against him because it was from Moicano. His shoulder roll stuff has tightened up, but his shoulder often doesn't touch his chin, so it's actually just like turning side on with your chin hanging out. So the right hand should be there a fair amount, unless he's really tightened that up recently. I think going to the kicking game a lot more would help him, because Ortega is so side on and presents that lead leg. I would just try and either kick it, or if you're feeling really dickish, stomp on it, because it's often sideways. For Ortega, I can foresee him being aggressive in this fight. Holloway, in the last couple of fights, he's been a little bit more aggressive. Against Pettis, he sort of went after him. He did do some leading against Pettis, as in leading him around the ring. He led him towards him, and then he would spin into the back kick, and I think that's how he winded him in the last moments of that fight. But against Aldo, he was sort of walking the line between aggressive and cautious. He was constantly stepping in on Aldo so that Aldo couldn't kick as effectively. He always had his knee pointed out towards Aldo's kicking leg, which was quite interesting, because Aldo went to the kick once in that fight, I think total, and as soon as he kicked, Holloway stepped down the centre with the right hand. What I do like Ortega doing, and something that he seems to go to on a whim, but if he went to it more, he'd have even more success, is dig into the body. He has really good body punches, and by pressuring in so hard and taking the punches on the top of his head and on his almost shoulder roll, he can get in position to dig to the body quite well, and he's not scared of being taken down, so he's happy to walk into that position. I think that's an advantage he should push a lot more, because he's happy doing elbows, which obviously you have to get closer to do anyway, but I think he should really dig to the body against Max. I can't, it's difficult to know whether Holloway should take him down just to show that he can and not worry about it, or if he should just avoid them altogether, because Edgar went for one takedown and immediately changed his mind because Ortega was already punching through for an anaconda. I think if you're going to take Ortega down, it's got to be clinch takedowns. One thing I have noticed about Ortega is because he's so comfortable playing off his back, if you put him against the fence, that shuts down a lot of that, and also he's very reluctant to get up. It took him a long time to realise against Tavares that he couldn't play guard with his head crumpled up against the fence, and then he hit a stand-up, which was nice, but he was there for quite a while. This is a fascinating fight because it's a real generalist versus a specialist. Two completely different styles of fighters, but two very, very high-level guys. Two of the best in the world at any weight, in my humble opinion. Even though Ortega has so many flaws, he makes up for it by being so good at the things he does well. But as you can tell, I want both of them to just be punching each other in the body all the time. Because both of them has fucking iron jaws. And then Miocic versus Daniel Cormier. I'm going to be writing something big about this later in the week, so I won't go too much into detail on it. Oh, I can feel the people who have only tuned in for this episode being pissed off. I'm sorry, but I've got thoughts on it that I'd quite like to articulate with GIFs and diagrams and shit. I would lean towards Miocic. If Cormier fights how Cormier normally fights and Miocic fights how he normally fights, I would lean towards Miocic because he's got, he's the bigger man, he's good at stopping takedowns, he's got the jab and he's got the powerful right hand. That's more than enough to give Daniel Cormier trouble. What I would like to see is Daniel Cormier, he has a good left hook, and I think the left hook could be real trouble for Stipe Miocic. There aren't a lot of great left hookers at heavyweight, and of course he did fight Mark Hunt, who is one of the very few good left hookers at heavyweight, and he diffused that with his jab and his feints and stuff, and by being able to drop onto the hips whenever he wanted to. Cormier, you've got to think he's going to be more reluctant shooting takedowns on Cormier, so the level change isn't so much of a worry. What Cormier can do is he does that weird mummy stance with his hands extended as he was doing against John Jones, which we were all going, God, that's awful, you're going to get a head kick to stop doing it. But I think against Stipe, he could actually use that to his advantage, because if you hang your lead hand out there against Stipe, he is going to reach for it, he's going to trap it, and he's going to try and shoot the right hand over the top of it. If Cormier can use that and draw the hand trap to right straight, he can duck down and try and come up with the left hook. Obviously, there's a great chance that Daniel Cormier hasn't done any work about that at all in his camp. But I think that's a really big opening, because Stipe, his whole right side, when he throws his right hand, he's got God's own right hand, but when he's drawing back after it, he is completely exposed. He doesn't close the door well. He very rarely left hooks. His left hook isn't anything to write home about. And, he throws so much of his being into that right hand that he's got it's like a vacuum cleaner cord. He throws it out and he's got to go and draw it in again. I think a guy with a good left hook and level change could give Stipe Miocic fucking hell, to be honest. And, even if he's not drawing, that's a very risky way to draw it. But if Cormier can go in with the jab and the jab to the body and then come up with the left hook, that would be great. He was hooking off the jab really well against John Jones, who had a massive reach and height advantage on him. Stipe's is much less significant. So using the hook off the jab against him there could be great. He used it against Bigfoot Silva too, actually. And if he can hook off the jab, and if he can jab and level change and then come up with the hook, that all sets up going for the back leg for the high crotch, or just going for a double if Stipe squares up. For Miocic, I think the jab has got to be a big part of the game plan. You probably don't want to be getting into prolonged exchanges with a guy who can drop on your hips and come up with that high crotch at any time. And that high crotch is so slick. It's clear that he's done like 20 years of just picking up that high crotch, tilting it one way, they react, he comes back the other, picks them up, slings them through the air. Because every time he does it against someone, they are completely clueless. And it's not a case of being clueless, it's a case of he has that chain down to a T, and as soon as you're reacting to one thing, he's flinging you through the air. That is a fascinating fight. We will do a huge piece on it. It'll be like Killing the King or Battle of Kings or something about kings. I hate titles. I'm shit at titles. If I'd written Bob Sager's Night Moves, it would have been called Learning to Fuck. But I'll think of something good to call it. Anyway, we're way over time today, and I have some questions lined up, but fuck, there's so much going on. That event looks amazing. We'll catch up again on Monday, and we're getting into a period where there's actually some decent cards on. We've got Bellator's sort of mini international fight weekend coming up next weekend. We're back in the good again. This is such a weird sport to cover, because some weeks you're like, God, this is the best sport in the world to cover, and then you've got 2 week stretches where you're like, oh, this sport, I fucking hate it, there's nothing going on. But anyway, if you want to help fund and produce the show and get the history episodes, sign up to the Patreon. I've got something on the early K1s in the works for the next couple of weeks, and I'm also just throwing this idea out there, tell me if you hate it, but I wanted to sort of stretch out and do a little bit more history. Not, stealing Pat Wyman's thing, but, I said nobody would be interested in a karate history episode, and then suddenly everyone was really interested in a karate history episode. I was actually looking at an event that I've always had a great interest in, which is sort of linked to the martial arts in an interesting sort of mystical way. And it's an event that is both a real event and has become a bit of a myth in many quarters as well. The Boxer Rebellion, a very famous thing between the Chinese and the English in China. It also lets me talk about the British Empire a bit, which is always good fun. So let me know how you feel about that. That'll be like a month or two's time, because it's going to take some serious research. Whereas when we're talking about boxers, I know most of the details of most of them anyway, and then I just build out around it with reading. But let me know how you feel about that one. And that would also open the door to going back and doing Shaolin and Wudang, because everyone wants to talk about the temples. And it would also let me use some of my Wu-Tang Clan knowledge in an episode, which would be fun. The new issue of Notorious, I believe, is out now. All my work is on thefightprimer.com. And if you have an email, we'll probably need some questions for next week, even though I've got a couple queued up now. fightsgoneby.podcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. I'm so hype about this event. I'm also really fucking sweaty, because it is something like 30 degrees in the UK at the moment. I am recording this podcast in literally just my pants, underpants that is, and I am covering this chair in sweat. It's absolutely revolting. And on that beautiful thought, I will catch you next week. Cheers.